Thank you for joining the archive today, Tok Thompson. It's exciting to have you on. You are an anthropologist. So just quickly to get started, can we dive just a little bit into what an anthropologist is for folks at home who don't know what an anthropologist is, and why not only did you get into it, but also why do you explore folklore and history as an anthropologist?
That's a couple of big questions, and I'll try to do it quickly. But I am both a folklorist and an anthropologist. It's two separate disciplines, but I kind of have a foot in either world. As an anthropologist, I'm trained in anthropology. I have my undergrad and my PhDs in anthropology, and then I have a master's degree in folklore. So I've kind of kept these two things entwined, and also kept up with archaeology pretty well. But really, I publish and work and teach in anthropology and folklore studies. So it's kind of interesting because there are two different disciplines, but they kind of study a lot of the same stuff, or at least I can study the same stuff with them. So you might think of me as an anthropologist in the sense that I study different societies around the world and sort of the sort of the macro picture of what is humanity and how do we act in different places, what is human diversity and what has it been in the past. And yet with those macro questions, what I like to focus on is the folklore. What people tell each other, the stories, particularly the stories. I think we pass most of our culture on with stories, but there's other things too, right? There's folk music, there's folk dance, there's folk architecture, folk crafts, folk medicine, right? So any sort of knowledge or lore that people pass to each other. So that is what I study. But unlike most folklorists usually study one country, usually their home country. I study a variety of cultures around the world and try to do it somewhat cross-culturally, comparatively. So there's just a lot of richness out there. And once you dive into it, you start realizing, even in your own local community, there's so much richness in terms of culture. So it just takes going out and listening to people, interviewing them. I have my students do this. We record it. We put it up at the USC Folklore Archives. This is what folklorists do. We record people or we write down what they say and we archive it and then we have it as data. So for example, I love ghost stories. I teach a class at USC for freshmen, and it's called Ghost Stories Throughout Time and Around the World. So on the one hand, we're looking at different societies and different religions and different peoples around the world. On the other hand, we're always looking at ghost stories. What are their ghost stories? Do they have them? Is what they call that really a ghost? Does it translate really well? How are their ghosts different from our ghost? What does that mean? That sort of thing. So I'm not out there to actually prove whether ghosts are real or not. I'm not going out with that's not what I do as a folklorist. But what is real are those stories, right? People do tell those stories, and we know that. We collect them, we archive them, we write them down. And so those beliefs and those stories and those practices that go along with, say, ghosts, are very, very real. And that's very valid, good scientific data that we can really use and analyze and learn different things about different places, whether or not the stories are true. But it's always sort of interesting when people do believe something that is not scientifically accepted. Why do they believe something if science says, no? So that's always an interesting factor. Ghosts, aliens. If we don't really have any proof, why do people, fairy folk in some places? If you don't have any proof, why do people believe in a certain thing? So it's a huge question, and there's a lot of sort of, multiple ways that you can look at this.
All right. So that kind of produces my first question. What are some of the things that you find cross-culturally everywhere you go? I mean, we've talked about ghosts, but what else might be there?
Well, okay, you can find ghosts in most cultures around the world, but not all, right? So there are some societies where ghosts don't exist. So that's always kind of interesting. Why do most societies believe in ghosts and yet some don't? And then, or even what we might translate as a ghost. Is it really a ghost? The most ghosts in the world might be sort of East Asia, but they work very different than American ghosts. They tend to be corporal. They're not little wispy things. So they don't waltz through walls in general. They open doors and you can shake them. Shake their hand. You can pat them on the back. So only later on finding their ghosts. So what is it to say about our different beliefs about the soul or religion? So I mean, anything you look at, you're going to find there are no universals in folklore. There's nothing that everybody has the same story. Everybody has. But you do have a lot of commonalities. You do have a lot of popular themes and motifs and stories. So you can contrast different countries. For example, like Americans tend to believe in aliens. Most Americans believe in sort of the aliens, ancient aliens, or contemporary aliens, or whichever. It's over 60%. I find that fascinating because, again, we don't really have any, accepted scientific evidence for this. It doesn't really line up with the official religious theologies, and yet most Americans believe in them. Most Americans also believe in ghosts. So I have a friend in Iceland, and he does similar research over there. So he did surveys recently, and like, what do they believe in? Iceland has their little people, they're sort of their elves or their hidden folk, Holder folk. They really, really believe in those. That is considered very, very believable. Most Icelanders also think that ghosts are probably real. Most is about the same as America, it seems like, ghost belief. On the other hand, when they asked about aliens, it was like almost none thought that this was remotely plausible. Like they thought it was ludicrous and laughable, right? So why is one thing like fairy folk kind of ludicrous and laughable in America, but tend to be believed in Iceland, and aliens believable in America, but ludicrous in Iceland. And so it shows maybe different sort of cultural patterns or interests or things like that. I mean, they're kind of similar if you think about it, fairy folk and aliens, right? They're very often little green men. They capture people, they take them, they do strange things to them. The people that do come back are marked different somehow. They're portals into another realm. They have strange, wondrous things that we don't know how they work. We benefit from them, but they are dangerous. A lot of the stories, like alien abduction, really came from fairy abductions. You can draw a direct line. These are the sort of the older version that you find in, let's say, Ireland or Iceland or things. So again, what is plausible in one culture and not in another? Fascinating, right? You can ask yourself a lot of questions around those.
Yeah. And so, speaking about metaphysical beings like fairies, elves, Jinn immediately came to mind when you started talking about fairies and earlier. So, have you found commonalities and differences in some of these metaphysical beings cross culturally across the world?
It's fascinating to me that so many cultures do have supernatural beings. So, even the word supernatural is a little tricky for a lot of these cultures. They may not be terribly supernatural; they may be completely natural. But this idea that there are these other beings around, little people, for example, are a common theme in Ireland, but they're also a really common theme for Native Americans. Native Americans have their little people, various in various groups, of course, but very, very common. So it's kind of interesting that what is shared by different cultures, and then also, again, like I said, the differences, what isn't shared or what comes across radically differently in different cultures. And again, I'm not trying to prove that aliens are real or the fairy folk are real. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. That's somebody else's department. But what is real are those stories. Those stories are real.
Yeah, yeah. So what might be for little people in Ireland compared to Native American beliefs? What might be the differences and similarities?
Okay, so in Ireland, they're very much connected with the megalithic sites, these great big stone structures that date from the Neolithic age, like Newgrange is probably the most famous example. They're linked with those sites. You don't really have that for the Native American beliefs so much. And again, Native America, it's a continent, right? Wide. So I come from Alaska, so I'm most familiar with those traditions, particularly like say the Little People traditions or something. They also have ghosts. Right? Native Americans have ghosts, but their ghosts work a little differently than our ghosts, and they have a lot of animal ghosts. We don't tend to have animal ghosts in the United States. It's only people that become ghosts. Sometimes a beloved pet, you get those stories. But only the beloved pets, not like the pets that people didn't really like. They never come back. We don't. Why don't we have animal ghosts? Right? Why do Native Americans? Well, I think the answer is that in Abrahamic traditions, only people have souls. Right?
Mhm.
So if you don't have a soul, how can you have a ghost? On the other hand, in Native American traditions, animals definitely have souls. Absolutely, absolutely, they do. So yes, they can produce ghosts. So these things can be tied in with these wider sort of cultural belief systems.
Okay, but just jumping quickly back, I love trying to hear more Native American stories. So, like, what might have been sort of the Alaskan little people stories that you're familiar with?
Again, there's a whole bunch of them. So you go out and you collect them, or people have done this in the past, and there's a lot of books out that include these sort of stories. One of the ones I'm most familiar with is from my hometown. It was from Peter Kalifornsky, who was the last local Dena'ina speaker in my hometown. My folks knew him very well. He put out a book, bilingual, about sort of Dena'ina ways. That's the local tribe in my home area, and a couple of them talked about little people, including one time that he saw one when he was in a sauna with somebody else. And according to the story that he wrote down, they were out having a sauna somewhere out in the lake, and it was his friend who was not native who said, "Holy cow, what's that?" And looked at this little small green person. And Peter Kalifornsky said, "Oh, I know what that is. I forget the name, but he had the Dena'ina name for it." So, and that was the story that he wrote down in the book, right? And he wrote this down as factually real. So there's a lot of these little stories. They tend to be sort of small, connected with the spirit realm, sort of magical, very often mischievous, and in that sense, kind of like the fairy folk in Ireland. Not bad, but not necessarily good either. More good than bad, but you don't want to mess with them, that sort of thing. And they can help people out sometimes if they're treated right. Other times it can be they're powerful, they're dangerous. You got to be careful around them. This is very, very true in say, Irish fairy folklore as well. But there's big differences. Again, the Irish fairy folk are connected with the mounds, the megalithic mounds. They're also connected with the realm of the dead. So Irish fairy folk are basically sort of the aristocracy of ghosts, right? And when people die in this older tradition, they get hosted by the fairy folk. You probably heard the banshee, right?
Yeah.
Who is this? Yeah, that is like a traditional fairy folk in Ireland, right? Just the banshee. It means woman of the she, and the word she means either those megalithic mouths, or it also means the spirits of those mouths. So when we say fairy folk in English, we really mean she, which in Ireland means the mounds and the spirits. And these are the realms of the dead. They're very spooky, they're very ominous. The banshee is a woman of the she, a woman of the mounds. And so there's a huge connection with this idea of the realm of the dead in Irish fairy lore that you really don't get with the little people so much in the Native American traditions, at least where I come from.
All right, that's interesting. That's pretty unique though to hear about those commonalities. Small green people that have those
Well, yeah, and then
supernatural.
look at how aliens are often described too, right? Very often small green people, right? So there's just something about that colored green that keeps popping up.
Yeah, interesting. Um, so like cross culture. Yeah, I'm now tripping on my tongue. Um, so also kind of hopping back to ghosts for a second. You were mentioning earlier that we had that in Native American beliefs, animals do have souls. They can be ghosts. And when you look more towards the Abrahamic beliefs, they only humans have souls.
Right. I mean,
And
people might disagree, but this is the official line from the Abrahamic churches, right? That only pets do not go into heaven, right? There is no afterlife for animals. We
Mhm.
may be 98.9% genetically the same as chimpanzees, but they have 0% soul in the Abrahamic framework. We have 100%. So it's a big binary there.
Okay. So that is pretty interesting because in some of the Native American creation myths in particular, I started rereading a book on by Chris McNabb, and it's talking about in the creation myths, in a general sense, how all the animals took part in helping bring
Right,
humans into this world and
right,
help
right,
establish
exactly.
it.
Exactly. That's a part of that same view of animals, right? If you're creation stories, everything goes back to myth, right? If you boil all culture down, you want to look at why one culture thinks one way, another one does. Eventually, you're going to end up back at myth. And myth is a very important but understudied, actually, aspect of folklore because this really sets up our core beliefs and terminologies. And so, if you look at the Abrahamic myth, which is shared by all the Abrahamic traditions, Garden of Eden, what starts off the universe? A guy, right? A usually envisioned as a male being that looks very much like a Homo sapiens sapien, right? God created man in His image, not the image of a raven, not the image of a right. So this sets up the idea that the universe is all about us, as a species. Native American mythologies don't tend to do this. They tend to include animals very often. Animals create us, in fact, that they were here first, they create the world, and only later did they create us. Which is actually, interestingly enough, what science says, right? So it's interesting to see, a lot of Americans don't believe in evolution, right? I mean, why not, right? This is basic science. Well, I think it contrasts with the creation story. It's all about us. We were here first. If you look at the Native American creation story, it actually lines up better with what science is saying. That animals were here first. They sort of created the world, if you were, and then we popped in later on in the story. But then it also sets up a different way of thinking about animals, right? If the raven helped create your world, then every time you see a raven, you're going to think of it as an important being, right? That raven out there is not a god necessarily, just like every person isn't God, but it's a spiritual being, right? So they would look at every animal as well as every person, as well as every living thing, frankly, as a spiritual being. Which we don't, right? We don't look at trees as having souls or wolves or whales, completely mundane. So this is, it can tell you a lot about, a ghost story can tell you a lot about a culture. You start linking it with these other beliefs and core mythologies and things.
Yeah. Have you seen any of these commonalities with other cultures? Like, have you seen other cultures that share that same perspective with Native Americans as about animals or other
Animals? Yeah,
cultures?
yeah, in general, yeah, sure. This is sort of animism, you might say. And animism is found in several distinct societies around the world, but it pops up differently. So, to some degree, Australian Aboriginal culture is animistic in the fact that they all have souls and animals have souls. On the other hand, Australian Aboriginal mythology and religion and cosmology is just absolutely radically different from that of Native Americans. So there's huge, huge differences between the systems, even though they all might be sort of animistic. So what ties in the sort of the Native American systems, this is true in North America, Central America, South America, all the way down, is a sort of package of shamanism plus animism, a particular core practice, as well as particular core mythologies that really tie all these areas together. And it's actually not just the Americas, it actually is also, to some degree, in the circumpolar realm, right? The Russian Far East, and really all the way over to the Sami, right, in Lapland. They also had traditions of shamanism and animism. But it's basically when you talk about sort of the Native American package, you sort of mean the Americas and the circumpolar realm, and you can talk about those as sort of a fairly cohesive cosmological view. Shamanism is found all throughout that realm and nowhere else. I really, people talk about Irish shamanism. It's bogus. That's no, it never happened.
Interesting.
I
I'm
mean, it happened, but we
actually I
certainly
kind
have
of
no proof it happened. I shouldn't say it never happened because we don't know, but there is certainly no proof of it happened. I should say that. That's a more
okay,
conscious
interesting.
statement.
Yeah. Was that something I'm curious to ask a little bit about it? Things like that term Irish shamanism or that belief.
Yeah, it's in Europe. They very often use the term shamanism to mean anything that's not like an organized religion. But this is not really, from an anthropological point of view, it's not accurate. Shamanism is a very distinct thing that is found at an incredibly deep timeline, again, in all of the Americas and in the circumpolar realm. So shamanism plus animism produces this sort of particular flavor, you might say, of this of how to think about animals and how to interact with the spirit world and that sort of thing.
Okay. All right. So that is interesting. I'm
Let me point out one more thing while I'm thinking about it, while we're on
yeah.
the topic. I was talking about how these things link up with cosmologies, and so why is alien belief so high? Right? You might say, well, that's because aliens are here. Perfectly plausible. But let's say if it's choice B, if the aliens are not here, why is alien belief so high in America and not, say, in Iceland? Right? You might say, well, the aliens aren't visiting Iceland; they're only visiting here. Maybe. But maybe there's other reasons. So, why aliens and not fairy folk, right? Why is the one ridiculous, the one little green man ridiculous, and the one plausible? And so, one of the things about the aliens is it's this idea of going up into the heavens. This works out well in Abrahamic cultures, right? Because up is good, heaven is good. Right? If I be up on high, that's good. That's where God is. The devil is down there in the abyss. And these are all metaphors. We know that the earth is a little globe spinning around, and what's up now will be. But on the metaphor. If you ask people in the street, quick point to heaven, everybody points up. Right? So up is good in our culture. If I say you're getting a high grade in my class, I mean you're getting a good grade. Why? Why is high good? Because that's where God is in our mythology. There's other mythologies where the divine is down there, so low is good. High is getting away from God. Right. So why do we like space? Why do we like the idea of going to space? And why do we look to the heavens for sort of rescue? I think it aligns very, very well with Abrahamic mythology. Again, most Americans believe sort of the ancient aliens, but most Americans also believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, both over 60%. What that means is many people believe both, right? You have a lot of Christians who are also alien believers. Right, there's a lot of commonalities. We're going up to the skies. We're going to get. We're going to ascend, either a day of judgment thing or just from a big UFO. And so I think it's very appealing for people to look to the heavens for answers coming from an Abrahamic creation story.
Interesting. Okay. So that's kind of fascinating because the first thing that came to my mind was like a couple hundred years ago, the church was killing people for talking about the possibility of aliens, and now these ideas are merging together. I think actually NASA hired like a couple of years ago, I think a bishop or a priest to help counsel astronauts if they meet an ET. So
So far, we haven't had to use that, so just keep that in mind.
yeah,
But yeah. So so you have like, and a lot of people are combining these beliefs in some religious traditions in America, like the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. This is explicitly a part of the sort of Book of Mormon. That Jehovah lives on a planet, and the Garden of Eden was another planet. It all has like space travel and stuff built in, and there are other inhabited worlds with other aliens that Jehovah rules over. So like LDS, which is a fairly old church now, fairly well sort of a mainstream church has this built in. And of course, this is a very American thing. It started fairly late in the Americas. And then you've got a whole bunch of these newer ones, right? Scientology is all about alien travel and stuff. Their mythology stories. The Aliens. Have you heard of the Aliens?
no, I've not.
Oh yeah, check out the aliens. So they claim to be in direct contact with aliens, and in fact, I think their leader claims to be an alien, and they claim to do all this sort of amazing things. And it's fast-growing international religion, actually, and the aliens, and it's all built around space travel. So the alien phenomena is quickly becoming very religious, right? You're
Yeah.
getting a lot of religious overtones, and people speak about spiritual experiences with aliens and things. So is it alien belief can either be presented as a legend, like maybe this happened, maybe it didn't, but it can also, for some people, take on a sacred quality, which is to say a mythic quality, right? That these came down and helped create who we are, and therefore who we are part star children, and therefore we need to explore Mars rather than saving the Earth, right?
Okay.
So this is a big part of the package, I think.
Okay. So, looking cross culturally, do you see things where it would help open the floodgate historically for why suddenly in the modern day people are okay with Jesus and aliens, or why?
Well, they're pretty congruent, I think, like that. There was the big book that was very influential, right? The von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods. And he basically said that the Bible is really about aliens, right? All these angels coming down from the skies are really aliens coming down from the skies. So these two strands for many millions and millions of Americans, I would say probably most Americans, we look at the statistics, have sort of merged through this sort of thing, which I find fascinating. And again, I think like for most traditional Native American viewpoints, that would be sort of, again, not really interesting, right? They're much more, I think, concerned about life on Earth than the absence of life outside of Earth.
Okay. All right. So actually, still talking about the Earth, let's go in reverse direction. You talked about earlier how there's religions that or cultures that down below is where God is. So
Yeah,
what
or the Earth
cultures out
itself,
there?
or the Earth itself, and that's where heaven is. That's where you go when you die, right?
Mhm.
But in Abrahamic traditions, we leave the Earth, and eventually, if you remember the story, God destroys it and takes everybody up. So in the Abrahamic traditions, the Earth is not sacred, it is not heaven, it is not numinous, it's mundane, it's temporary, and God's going to destroy it right before He takes all of the deserving people up to heaven. Right? That's the story. So at that point, like, why care about the Earth? It's not spiritual, it's not mundane, it's not heaven. But if you come from traditions like Native Americans, or even maybe more dramatically, the Australian Aboriginal traditions, this is heaven. This is where you go when you die, and this is where God is. So don't mess it up, right? You wouldn't tear down heaven. You wouldn't mine heaven. You wouldn't pollute heaven, right?
All right. So what are so getting outside of the Abrahamic traditions, what are the cultures you found that, you know, aside from Native Americans, that celebrate Earth as heaven or an
Yeah, I
underworld?
would say a lot of cultures. I would say it goes along with animism, the sort of belief that other living things have souls. Very often, this is including the earth itself, including maybe rivers or even stuff like that. And I think the most heightened version that I know of this is the Australian Aboriginal version, which is again that the earth is where everything sacred is. They actually have stories about how the earth was created, but in Australian traditions, the main sort of creation time to pay attention to, the earth was there, but it was completely flat in the beginning. And then came along the totemic ancestors, which are very important little beings to keep track of. And through their stories and their adventures, they created a topography, the mountains, the rivers, everything. They created the world in a sense. They shaped the world. It was already there, but they shaped it. So these totemic ancestors, then their stories are all about, the geology, right, and the hydrology, and so these stories will tell you where the water holes are. These stories will tell you what the topography is, right? And so you can think back. These stories have been going on for tens of thousands of years, and people that didn't, have writing or printed maps or something, but they allow people. You're living in one area, but you already know the topography because you have all these mythic stories. And so this is where all the spirits are. These are where the totemic ancestors are. It's sort of interesting too. There's one. When all this happens, this is called the dream time. And the idea is that the dream time is real and it's eternal, almost like heaven. But it's when the earth was formed. And the idea is that we are not quite on dream time. We've deviated. Again, maybe shades of Garden of Eden story here. But the idea is that you're trying to think about dream time because it's more real than our world. So you're always trying to improve your knowledge of the dream time, which is about the totemic ancestors and the landscape itself. And this is when, if you're trying to be a devout person in these traditions, you might go on a walkabout. You've probably heard of a walkabout. It's not just sort of wandering around. It's not like a Native American vision quest. It's very specifically, you are trying to follow the route of your totemic ancestor and sort of go over his stories. It gets complex.
Yeah.
How do you get your totemic ancestor? You usually have one. So how do you don't inherit it from your family. You don't inherit it from your community. In fact, you might have a different totemic ancestor than anybody in your village. So, but you might share this totemic ancestor with somebody in other villages or other speaking other languages. So religion, in this sense, or denominations, you might say, was sort of spread throughout Australia, linking people from one end of Australia to other people in Australia that had never met each other, lived thousands of miles apart. And so, so how do you get your totemic ancestor? You get it depending usually on where your mother was with you when she was 5 months pregnant with you, or thereabout, 5 or 6 months. So in other words, it's where she was in the land when your soul came into your body. For them, it's somewhere around the 5 to 6 months of the pregnancy. And then that becomes your totemic spirit. So that your soul or your denomination, your chief deity, if you will, is actually comes from the ground itself with you when your soul enters your mother's fetus, right? So what this means is you grow up and you're like, oh, your totemic ancestor is, I don't know, jumping kangaroo. Oh, okay. Well, nobody else in the village shares that. So you go on a walkabout. You follow his story. You follow where jumping kangaroo went and all of the topography. Along the way, you might meet other people in your same religion. Probably don't even speak the same language, but they're also interested in these same stories about jumping kangaroo. So how do you communicate? You don't speak the same language. How do you pass on these stories? Very often not with words. Very often with abstract designs, dances, dance moves, songs, singing. And so you would be on a walkabout, and they have the cave paintings and things that also might relate to these. You'd meet other people who are also on the same walkabout, trying to learn about, jumping kangaroo. And then you share these stories and this knowledge, very often without words. So in Australian Aboriginal tradition, it linked the whole continent was linked with people. I think this is why they never, ganged up on each other and went to war either, right? It's like, hey, this village, let's go attack that village. Well, wait a minute, there's a couple of guys in there that are my religion, and none of you guys are. right? So religion, I think, acted as a very sort of interesting, homeostatic mechanism. It looked like all these groups were completely dispersed, speaking all these different languages, but they shared identities dispersed across the landscape.
Wow.
So fascinating. It was just built in. Who you were as a person, it all came from the landscape. Who everybody was as a person comes from the landscape.
Wow. That is pretty cool. That is I've not heard of that anywhere before.
Yeah, and so this is why Australian Aboriginal traditions are very often opposed to large-scale development, mining, and this is a constant tension in Australia. Australia is one of the worst polluters in the world, and just recently, some great big mining company just ripped up a 40,000-year active traditional site, and then just sort of said, "Oops, sorry." So there's still a lot of cultural tensions around this in Australia, to be sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can see why. 40,000 years. A lot of
Yeah, this is
information
Australian
historians
Aboriginal
could have
tradition is
learned.
the world's longest lived religious tradition in that sense. It's been, the initial colonization of Australia is like 60,000 years. The last major influx about maybe 45,000 years ago of any people. And so it's been developing on its own for that long, right? And it's developing uniquely. Nobody from 45,000 years ago until sort of the British colonists sailed over, nobody had come to Australia. So they've been developing on their own trajectory for a long time.
That's amazing. So I'm curious, how has that evolved? Have you been able to see any kind of evolution or find any evolution? How it's progressed over a 45,000 year, 60,000 year period?
Oh, I mean, in terms of biological evolution, I don't think Homo sapiens have changed all
No,
that
no, no.
much
I mean
in
the cultural belief.
Oh,
This.
the cultural. I tend not to use evolution when I'm talking about cultural beliefs. That's I tend to restrict evolution to biology. Cultures don't evolve, in my opinion. They change, they adapt. They don't necessarily evolve.
Okay, but
Ch-
the changes
ch-
over that 45 to 60,000 years.
yeah, sure, there are changes, but what's also cool is that there's things that are exactly the same. So, like the hand paintings that you see and some of these cave paintings, some of these things are like, 40, 50,000 years old, but they're still active traditions. People still go in there and adding to them, right? So, I don't know any in the world, I don't know any sort of active traditions that have been going on for that long.
Wow, that's amazing. So they still to this day do hand paintings, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And again, this is usually done as part of the walkabout when you're exploring or retracing or engaging in the stories of your totemic ancestry.
Okay. Is there anything else they do besides those hand paintings? Still
Oh
to this.
yeah, yeah, yeah. All these sort of abstract designs and all of this sort of cave art and all the sort of art, rock art and stuff they do, and all of it, including all of their music and their dances, all of it are expressions of these creation stories that are all about the landscape.
Oh my God. That's it. That's awesome. Um,
Yeah, and so it's a very, very tight relationship in those societies between spirituality and the landscape itself. So you can see why, like, there tend to be anti-development, right? And, you don't dig up heaven, you don't plow down the pearly gates.
yeah, yeah, I totally understand that. I mean, I'm kind of there with them in many ways.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a real tense issue in Australia and has been for quite some time. So again, a lot of cultural differences and arguments, I would say, between cultures also very often boil down to myth.
okay. So when you were talking at the beginning about these Australian beliefs, you talked about dream space. And my first thought came to mind was Hinduism and Buddhism, how you're trying to reach, I can't even say, I can't even think of the word right now. It starts with a B in Hinduism, but in Hinduism and Buddhism, it's a nirvana. Is there a similarity trying to achieve this?
Not really. No, very, very distinct traditions. I mean, the idea of nirvana, that, of course, is a chief tenet of Buddhism. This is the idea that one can spiritually purify oneself and gradually sort of, ascend into the spirit realm. So that there is sort of eventual heaven, but most people are going to take a long time to get there, right? This is Buddhism. Maybe never get there. Hinduism and a lot of the Vedic traditions have some similar ideas of the karmic progression that you're going to get recycled. And if you're a bad person, you'll come back as a lesser life form, right? Maybe a dog or maybe a cockroach or something like that. And that you sort of are that humans are usually considered the last step before achieving enlightenment or going on. So Hinduism is interesting and Buddhism is interesting. They do sort of allow for other animals to have souls and spirits, although it's always put on this sort of hierarchy that they are lesser than us. With the Native Americans, again, not quite so fast, right? A lot of their stories relate that the animals are sort of the elder brothers, that they created us, that they are sort of they're the chief deities, right? And even if we're smart and clever, they also kind of demand respect, and that their souls might be sort of on an equal basis. So there's profound differences. And then with the Australian, the idea that the dream time, that there is another reality, sort of like heaven or something, that is eternal and that is going on and that you can try to tap into. It's almost like the idea of heaven, except that it's a different time. It's at that moment of creation of the landscape. So these ideas of time are very different in all of these. And I think particularly the Australian example, right? That there was one moment in time that became eternal, if you will, and we keep trying to get back to it.
Okay, interesting.
And there's an interesting point about that too, is that very often people do this with myths. We bring myths in at important times up in our culture, so we return to that sort of original moment. So if you look at like wedding rituals in the United States, this idea of like the father giving away the bride. Yeah, have you ever seen classical paintings of when God created Eve and he shows up with Eve and gives her to Adam? So here's the Father God giving the bride to the groom. So this is replicated in our wedding rituals, these mythic moments, if you will.
Wow. Very yeah, that is very interesting. Very interesting.
This
Oh,
to be true cross-culturally. In important rituals, cultures very often reference their myths, their creation stories.
reference, yeah, because that builds a foundation of belief within people.
Yeah, even language, right? Our language is built from our myths. I mean, whether I believe it or not, this is still my Adam's apple, right? I mean, this is whether I believe in the story or not, this is your Adam's apple, right? So these things are built into the societies. The whole thing with gender, like people are like, well, wait a minute, there's only two genders. Why do you think there's only two genders? Adam and Eve, right? I mean, there's plenty of other societies that have more than two genders. Many, I don't know of any Native American societies that only had two. Right? Most allowed for more than two genders. Most allowed for people to change their genders, and sometimes people would change their genders over the course of their life, sometimes several times. Some groups had up to 5 genders. Right? So biology, but gender is gender. These are two gender is a cultural elaboration of biology, and some of those cultural elaborations can get pretty elaborate. So, why do Abrahamic impacted Americans have a hard time understanding this pretty simple lesson from anthropology? Again, I think just like Adam and Eve. If you remember the gay marriage debate back when it was a debate just a few years ago, there was a big talking point that we can't have gay marriage because God didn't created Adam and Eve. He didn't create Adam and Steve, right? So for a while there was like, who's this Steve guy showing up, right? So again, what's happening? Well, people are referencing this creation story to make a contemporary political point about how you should live your life. So myths are omnipresent. We tend to be unconscious of them. I mean, we just think that there's only two genders because Adam and Eve, and our society has only two genders. Sure, but why does our society only have two genders? Oh, because Adam and Eve, right? So this becomes a naturalizing thing. This is what myth does. It makes our cultural seem completely natural, and therefore other cultures seem wacky.
Wow. Okay. That is wow, definitely food for thought, to say the least.
Anthropology is a fun thing to study. It shows you what's out there, what different cultures do, and then whenever you learn about other cultures, you very very quickly learn a thing or two about your own culture. Right? When you learn about other people, you quickly learn a thing or two about yourself.
Yeah. All right, and so kind of keep it all within the hour talk. Is there any last words or anything you'd like to share with future generations?
Well, future generations, I hope there will be some. We're right now going through global climate devastation. This is the 6th great extinction of life on Earth. This is the biggest extinction of life on Earth in 65 million years, I believe. Last one was because of an asteroid, but this one is not because of an asteroid. This is because of us and our culture. It's not because of indigenous peoples. They're not the cause of this. It is sort of capitalism and industrialism and modernity, if you will. So I hope there will be future generations. We're not good. Somebody said, "Oh wow, this is the hottest summer ever." I'm like, "Oh no, this is the coolest summer you're ever going to see," in all likelihood. So we're not on a sustainable path. and it's going to require great change. I don't think the answer. Some people, there's a huge escapist fantasy, like we're going to get in a little tin can and fly out to another world and wreck that one. I don't think so. I really don't think it's going to happen. First off, I don't think it's plausible or feasible. And secondly, even if it did happen, I don't want to be on board. I don't want to spend my life and my future children's life in a little tin can or something. No, it's ridiculous. I mean, how many people could fit on there? We're on the base spaceship you could possibly imagine, the best spaceship hurtling through the cosmos. All we have to do is take care of it.
All right. Thank you again, Tok.
Yeah, my pleasure. And one way we could take care of it is to learn from other people. Take a moment to learn about other mythologies, including ones where the earth is sacred.